Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're talking about American royalty. Yeah, you heard me right. Forget your powdered wigs and stuffy tea parties. We're diving into the story of the United States' actual emperor, a man named Joshua Abraham Norton, who woke up one day in booming San Francisco, decided he was in charge, and somehow the city went along with it. He even declared himself protector of Mexico. You know, just a little something extra for the resume. This isn't some fairy tale. This is history's dark comedy, where collective delusion meets a housing crisis and decides to crown a hobo. You're in booming San Francisco, chasing gold and glory. But your true ruler, a man in a tattered uniform issuing decrees from the streets. So before we plunge into this magnificent madness, hit like and subscribe, but only if you're ready for history's ugly, hilarious truth. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if your city would crown its own eccentric, homeless person king. I'm genuinely curious how many of you live in places that sane. Now dim the lights, brace yourself, and step into history's darkest corners, where the emperors wear rags and sanity is just a suggestion. And before he was His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Norton I, he was just Joshua Abraham Norton. Just another hopeful schmuck who washed up in San Francisco during the gold rush, looking to get rich quick. He arrived from South Africa in 1849, supposedly with $40,000, ready to stake his claim in the city's insane economy. San Francisco in the 1850s was less a city, more a chaotic, muddy explosion of ambition, whiskey, and desperation. The air smelled of saltwater, sawmills, and the ever-present aroma of human ambition turning into failure. Buildings popped up overnight, often collapsing just as fast, like a metaphor for everyone's get-rich schemes. Norton wasn't some starry-eyed prospector digging in the dirt. He was a businessman dealing in real estate and commodities. He was actually pretty good at it for a while, making smart investments in property that ballooned in value. You could almost call him successful. Almost. Then came the rice. In 1857, a ship arrived from Peru absolutely packed with rice. Rice was scarce and expensive in San Francisco. Norton saw his chance to corner the market. He bought the entire shipment for $25,000, planning to sell it at a massive profit. He thought he was a genius. The market would surely stay high, right? Just hold the supply, watch the price climb. What could go wrong? Turns out everything. Within weeks, other ships arrived, more rice, then even more rice. Suddenly, the market was flooded, prices crashed, and Norton's carefully hoarded fortune turned into mildewing grain nobody wanted. His $25,000 investment became worthless. His plans, his reputation, his sanity maybe, all washed away in a tidal wave of unwanted carbs. It was a spectacular public financial ruin. Think your worst stock market loss, but with way more rats and the lingering smell of failure. He tried suing, claiming he'd been swindled, but the courts basically laughed him out. Bankrupt, stripped of his assets, and publicly humiliated, Joshua Norton vanished from polite society. Or perhaps he simply decided polite society wasn't worth the hassle anymore. Maybe if you can't beat the system, you just declare yourself above it. Joshua Norton had just gone spectacularly broke thanks to a mountain of rice. Now most people, after that kind of public faceplint, might get a quiet job, move to another city, maybe take up competitive napping. Not Norton, he mulled things over. San Francisco was a mess anyway, wasn't it? Full of greedy politicians, shady deals, and citizens who clearly needed guidance. Guidance that perhaps only someone who had transcended mere mortal concerns like rent or not smelling faintly of failure could provide. So on September 17, 1859, Norton walked into the office of the San Francisco Bulletin newspaper. Imagine the scene. A guy, maybe looking a bit rough around the edges, perhaps smelling faintly of defeat and old ambitions, hands the editor a piece of paper. That paper wasn't a want ad or a complaint about the price of sourdough. It was a formal, utterly serious declaration. It stated that, due to the widespread corruption and chaos, Joshua Abraham Norton, a citizen of the Cape of Good Hope, now proclaimed himself Emperor of the United States. Just like that, no election, no coup, just a press release. The bulletin editor, bless their cynical soul, decided to print it. Maybe they thought it was a joke. Maybe they just needed to fill some space. Maybe they understood on some fundamental level that this city was weird enough to need an emperor, and this guy fit the bill perfectly. The decree itself is a masterpiece of deluded grandeur. It starts at the peremptory request of a large majority of the citizens of these United States. It went on to declare himself emperor and ordered the representatives of the different states to convene in San Francisco to make changes to the laws. Think about the audacity. Bankrupt, friendless, likely hungry, and this guy just decides he's in charge of a whole damn country. Your imposter syndrome wishes it had this level of confidence. This wasn't quiet madness muttered on a street corner. This was a public, printed assertion of absolute power, distributed to a city built on chaos and craving a little structure, no matter how absurd. The ink was barely dry on the paper before San Francisco had its emperor. The city just needed someone to fill the power vacuum, and Norton stepped up, even if his uniform wasn't quite ready yet. So now you have an emperor, great. Only problem: emperors usually have palaces, treasuries, maybe a solid gold toilet. Emperor Norton had, well, he had the streets of San Francisco. After declaring himself ruler, Norton didn't suddenly inherit a mansion. His imperial residence was wherever he could find a cheap room for the night, usually $1 a day lodging house if he was lucky. Most of the time, his throne room was a park bench, and his royal carriage was his own 2 feet. His daily routine was surprisingly routine for a monarch without a kingdom. He would wake up, get dressed in his increasingly elaborate, though never quite clean, military-style uniform. This wasn't Prada. This was donated, pieced-together military surplus, often faded and a little threadbare. Then he'd hit the streets. This was his patrol, his royal tour. He walked constantly, observing his subjects, inspecting the condition of the sidewalks, and keeping an eye on the general goings-on. He was a fixture, as predictable as the fog rolling in. He'd visit the reading rooms, poring over newspapers from around the world, keeping abreast of global events. Because, an emperor needs to be informed, even if his empire is just a few square miles and his subjects mostly tolerate him. The smell of old paper and cheap ink was probably his closest equivalent to royal incense. Lunch might be a free bowl of soup from a kind restaurateur, or maybe a meal paid for with one of his self-issued imperial bonds. These weren't gold coins. They were fancy pieces of paper with his face on them, promising future payment with interest. And somehow people accepted them. Try paying your landlord with a drawing of your face and a pinky promise. He'd spend hours engaging with people, not making speeches from a balcony, but chatting on street corners, listening to complaints, offering bizarre advice, and sometimes, right there on the spot, drafting a new imperial decree. He'd just whip out a pen and paper and write a law for the nation while standing next to a fish market. The smell of brine and imperial bureaucracy. His presence was so constant, so accepted, that the city's police force were even given standing orders not to harass him. Imagine that, the cops leaving you alone because you've successfully convinced a city you're its emperor. Your parking tickets wish they had this kind of diplomatic immunity. This street life was his reality, a blend of genuine poverty and utterly sincere pretense, played out daily for an audience that was both the cast and the critics. He didn't just claim to be emperor. He lived the role, even when living meant being cold, hungry, and without a roof over his imperial head. So Emperor Norton I is walking the streets, smelling vaguely of dignity and damp wool. But he wasn't just a mascot, he was a working monarch. And working monarchs issue laws via newspaper. His preferred method of governance was walking into a local paper like the San Francisco Bulletin or Chronicle, handing over a handwritten decree and demanding it be published. And because San Francisco was apparently co-running a performance art piece with a man who thought he was in charge, they usually printed them. The crinkling sound of a fresh imperial law being handed over must have been something. These decrees covered everything. He wasn't shy. On October 12, 1859, barely a month into his reign, he issued his most famous one, abolishing the United States Congress. Why? Because he deemed it infested with fraud and corruption. Honestly, who's gonna argue with that? He ordered the army to clear the legislative hall. Good luck with that, Your Majesty. When Congress predictably failed to disband, he followed up by abolishing the presidency too. Abraham Lincoln never heard of him, or rather considered him a temporary usurper. Imagine getting fired by a guy who lives in a boarding house. Your boss could never, but he wasn't just about tearing things down. Some of his decrees were surprisingly forward-thinking, or at least locally relevant. He proposed building a bridge connecting San Francisco and Oakland. This was decades before the Bay Bridge was actually built. The smell of possibility mixed with salty bay air must have fueled that particular vision. He also issued decrees on topics like regulating banks, preventing fraud, and protecting minorities. He even tried to enforce laws against using the offensive term Frisco. Yes, the Emperor of the United States cared deeply about local slang. He'd wander around, maybe near the wharves, smelling the fish and the tar, observing his city. Then decide that what the nation really needed was a decree on, say, the proper way to use street lamps. His laws ranged from national coups to hyperlocal urban planning, all delivered with the same unwavering imperial authority. His decrees were often read aloud in saloons or printed for laughs, but they were also a strange, living part of the city's narrative. They were proof that San Francisco wasn't just building a city. It was building a legend, one ridiculous, official-looking piece of paper at a time. You might ignore the homeless man, but you couldn't ignore the headline. Emperor Norton decrees. You've got a guy running around, dressed like he raided a costume shop, handing out pieces of paper that say Congress is canceled. What do you do if you're San Francisco in the 1860s? Most cities would probably call the men in white coats. Maybe the cops, definitely someone, but San Francisco decided to roll with it. They didn't just tolerate Emperor Norton, they embraced him. It wasn't a revolution, it was entertainment. In a city full of transient men, few families, and a brutal, unpredictable economy, Norton was a consistent, harmless spectacle. He was living proof that you didn't have to make sense to be somebody. Businesses started accepting his imperial bonds, those pieces of paper promising future payment. Shopkeepers and restaurateurs gave him free meals, not because they expected to cash in his bonds, but because he was good for business. People would come just to see the emperor. The clatter of plates and happy chatter mingled with the emperor's pronouncements. He was given the best seats at public events, the first to inspect new buildings or bridges. When a police officer, apparently new to town, once arrested Norton for vagrancy, the public outcry was immediate and furious. The chief of police personally apologized to the emperor and issued that standing order. Leave Norton alone. Your right to loiter isn't this well protected. People would salute him on the street, tip their hats, or even bow. Children were told to respect the emperor. He was listed in the city directory. He paid his taxes. He was more than a local character. He was a civic institution, a walking, talking symbol of the city's own eccentric, lawless spirit. This collective agreement to humor him wasn't just quirky, it was a bizarre social contract. The city got its daily dose of absurdity and a living legend, and Norton got a level of dignity, respect, and basic sustenance he wouldn't have had as just another homeless man. They called him Emperor. His reality called him fortunate. It showed a strange side of human nature, the willingness to participate in a shared delusion if it's entertaining enough. San Francisco built its own reality, one imperial decree at a time, proving that sometimes all you need for a kingdom is a uniform and a city willing to play along. An emperor needs regalia. You can't just wander around in your rice-stained failure clothes and expect respect, right? Even a pretend emperor needs a look that says, "Yes, I am in charge, please don't ask about my financial situation." Emperor Norton understood this implicitly. His uniform was his power suit, his armor, his walking declaration of sovereignty. His most famous ensemble was a faded blue military coat, often adorned with brass buttons and epaulets that had seen better days. The rough wool probably smelled of rain, city dust, and unwavering self-belief. On his head sat a magnificent beaver hat, typically decorated with a feather or a rosette. This hat was his crown, the most visible symbol of his authority. Imagine trying to look regal while your hat feels slightly damp and smells faintly of cured animal hide. Completing the look was a sword or a cane, sometimes both. The sword, often carried with a flourish, was purely ceremonial, less for combat, more for completing the emperor vibe. The clank of his sword dragging slightly on the cobblestones was part of the city's soundscape. His wardrobe wasn't static. He had several variations, some gifted by admirers or businesses. One uniform was a dark suit with a tall hat, another closer to a French military style. They were often patched, sometimes a little ragged, but always worn with total conviction. He wasn't dressing up, he was dressing as himself, the emperor. He'd spend hours polishing the brass buttons or trying to keep the beaver hat looking respectable. It was a job, this emperorship, and looking the part was crucial. This wasn't some trust fund kid playing dress-up. This was a man who had lost everything and built a new identity, stitch by faded stitch. The contrast between the grand titles and the slightly shabby reality of his clothing was part of the performance. It was grim irony made visible. He looked like a general who had just returned from a long, unsuccessful campaign, which, in a way, he had. His uniform wasn't just fabric and metal, it was a statement. It told San Francisco and anyone who saw him that despite his circumstances, this man was not to be dismissed. He was the emperor, and his slightly threadbare outfit was simply the uniform of his unique, self-created nation. Your best interview outfit wishes it commanded this much presence. You look the part, you issue decrees. But how do you actually eat? Imperial decrees don't pay the rent, and unfortunately, San Francisco wasn't literally paved with gold, just mud and questionable intentions. Emperor Norton had no job, no inherited fortune, no actual tax base unless you count the occasional tip. His treasury was, well, it was his pocket, and it was usually empty of conventional money. His solution was brilliant, insane, or maybe both. He created his own currency. He printed Imperial Government of Norton I bonds, notes, and warrants. These were pieces of paper, often quite elegantly printed, bearing his portrait or signature and a promise to pay a certain amount, usually with interest, at some unspecified future date. These weren't backed by gold, silver, or even a promising futures market in rice. They were backed by sheer confidence and the city's willingness to play along. He'd walk into a shop or a restaurant, consume goods or services, and then offer payment in his own imperial script. The feel of the crisp, official-looking paper must have felt bizarrely valuable in your hand. And here's the truly wild part: businesses accepted them. Barbers cut his hair, restaurants fed him, shops sold him supplies, all for these pieces of paper. Why? Partly charity, sure, but mostly it was good business. Accepting an Emperor Norton bond became a mark of being a true San Franciscan, a quirky badge of honor. It was cheap advertising and guaranteed conversation fodder. These bonds circulated like souvenirs, like playing cards with a deeply weird backstory. Some were kept as mementos, others were reportedly traded among collectors even during his lifetime. Your artisanal sourdough starter isn't this iconic. He also accepted gifts and donations, often framed as taxes or tributes. People would simply give him money out of respect, pity, or amusement. It was a voluntary tax system for a voluntary empire. His economic reality was a tightrope walk between genuine destitution and communal support, propped up by paper promises and the city's shared performance. He was broke, yet he commanded a strange form of credit built on charm and collective fantasy. The smell of his imperial currency probably smelled suspiciously like regular paper, proving that value is truly just whatever everyone agrees it is. It's all right, an emperor alone is just a guy in a hat. An emperor with a loyal entourage of scruffy, beloved street dogs, that's an icon. Meet Bummer and Lazarus. These weren't pedigree pups. They were stray mutts who became San Francisco celebrities in their own right. Bummer, a black and white terrier mix, was known for being a survivor, and Lazarus, a yellow mastiff mix, famously resurrected after being thought dead, hence the name. They lived the true street life, the smell of the gutters and the freedom of no fixed address. These two dogs somehow adopted San Francisco. They were often seen together, wandering the streets, scavenging, and occasionally getting into scraps. People fed them, police left them alone, and they became mascots for the city's resilience and slightly chaotic charm. Your neighborhood squirrel doesn't command this level of respect. And who did these royal strays frequently accompany? Emperor Norton, of course. Bummer and Lazarus were often seen trotting along behind his imperial majesty as he conducted his daily inspections. They weren't officially appointed court animals, but they were his most visible and possibly most loyal followers. Picture the scene: the slightly worn uniform, the grand hat, and two scruffy dogs padding along at his heels. The sound of paws on pavement mixed with the emperor's pronouncements. Did they understand his decrees? Probably just wanted scraps. Man's best friend, try an emperor's most reliable entourage. The city loved this trio. They were photographed together, written about in newspapers, and were as much a part of the San Francisco landscape as the fog and the cable cars. The coarse fur of a dog briefly resting against his leg might have been the warmest, most genuine connection he had some days. Their bond became legendary. When Bummer was attacked by another dog in 1862, Lazarus reportedly defended him ferociously. When Lazarus eventually died in 1863, Emperor Norton himself reportedly mourned him deeply. Bummer died a few years later and was given a lavish funeral. Their unique status was even formalized. A city ordinance was passed protecting Bummer and Lazarus from being captured by the dog catcher. Your perfectly groomed poodle wishes it had this kind of street cred and legal protection. The emperor's royal canines were perhaps the only subjects who never questioned his authority, and who offered unconditional companionship in a city built on conditional relationships. He's dressed, he's legislating, he's got dogs. What else does an emperor need? Apparently, another country to protect. Because being Emperor of the United States just wasn't enough for Norton. At some point after declaring himself emperor, he added a second, equally impressive and utterly baseless title: Protector of Mexico. Yes, the man ruling from a San Francisco boarding house decided he was also personally responsible for the welfare of a nation hundreds of miles south. Why Mexico? Well, the 1860s were a rough time for Mexico. It was embroiled in conflict with France, who, under Napoleon III, was trying to install a European Archduke Maximilian I as Emperor of Mexico. It was a bizarre, bloody mess, a genuine, violent imperial power play happening while San Francisco was humoring its own pretend emperor. Maybe Norton read the newspapers and saw the chaos. Maybe he felt a pang of international duty. Maybe he just liked the sound of the title, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. It has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? A ring that sounds suspiciously like a man who had completely checked out of reality. He never went to Mexico. He never sent troops. He never issued any decrees that had the slightest impact on Mexican politics. His protection consisted entirely of saying he was doing it. Your neighbor who watches the news and thinks they understand geopolitics. Norton was basically that, but with a hat and a title. San Francisco took this new title in stride. Of course, their emperor was also the protector of Mexico. Why the hell not? It just added another layer to the glorious shared delusion. They bought his bonds, they saluted his uniform, and they accepted that he was now overseeing events in a foreign country he'd never visited. The sheer, unadulterated nerve of it must have smelled like freedom, or possibly just really good weed. This dual title highlights the magnificent scale of Norton's break with reality and the city's incredible capacity for theatrical participation. He wasn't just emperor of their city. He was the emperor of their collective imagination, his reign extending as far as their willingness to suspend disbelief would carry it. His protection of Mexico was as real as his abolition of Congress, which is to say, not at all, but it was printed in the paper, and that was enough. So San Francisco loved its emperor. Businesses accepted his money, people tipped their hats, police looked the other way. He was a beloved eccentricity, a living legend. But even in a city as strange as San Francisco, there were limits. Sometimes, authority clashed with the emperor's reality distortion field. The most famous confrontation happened in 1867. A new police officer on the beat, identified as Officer Armand Barbier, didn't get the memo about leaving the emperor alone. Maybe he was fresh off the boat. Maybe he was just a stickler for the rules. Seeing a man in a military uniform who was clearly not in the military, and who was, technically, homeless, Barbier arrested Emperor Norton on charges of lunacy. Imagine the scene. The clanging of a police wagon, the indignity of being grabbed by a mere officer when you are the actual emperor of the United States and protector of Mexico. The smell of the paddy wagon must have been a stark contrast to the usual street air. This was a direct challenge to the city's shared performance. San Francisco did not react well. The public was outraged. Officer Barbier became instantly infamous. Newspaper editorials slammed the police department for their heavy-handedness and disrespect towards a man who, while perhaps delusional, was harmless and beloved. Chief of Police Patrick Crowley, a man clearly more attuned to the city's unique vibe, was forced to intervene. He personally ordered Norton's release. Not only that, he issued a formal apology from the police department to the emperor. An apology, your parking ticket dismissal wishes it came with this level of institutional groveling. Chief Crowley also reiterated firmly the standing order: leave Emperor Norton alone. He was to be treated with respect by all officers. He was a protected species in the urban jungle, his status elevated by public affection beyond the reach of mere laws like anti-vagrancy. This incident cemented Norton's position. It wasn't just that people tolerated him, they actively defended him. The city's collective fantasy had real-world consequences, effectively granting the emperor diplomatic immunity from common sense and minor offenses. It showed that in San Francisco, popular opinion could override police procedure. especially when the public was having this much fun with their emperor. Is your emperor of the US and protector of Mexico? Where do you go from there? Naturally, you start addressing other world powers. Because if you're running an empire from a single room in a boarding house, you might as well go global. Emperor Norton didn't just issue decrees for San Francisco or even the US. He felt it was his duty to engage with other monarchs and governments. He saw himself on equal footing with the Queen of England or the Emperor of France. Your biggest international interaction is probably arguing with someone online. Norton was writing formal letters to heads of state. He reportedly sent letters to Queen Victoria, offering advice or asserting his position. Imagine the scene in Buckingham Palace. The mail comes in, full of important state documents, and nestled among them is a letter from Emperor of the United States, Norton I, postmarked San Francisco. You can almost smell the confusion and potential bin liner aroma. He also took his role as protector of Mexico seriously enough to issue decrees related to the conflict there. While Napoleon III was busy trying to install his puppet Emperor Maximilian, Norton was apparently weighing in from California. His pronouncements on the Franco-Mexican War probably had about as much impact as a particularly aggressive seagull. His attempts at international diplomacy were predictably entirely one-sided. No foreign power ever formally recognized him. Queen Victoria did not write back. The French government did not seek his counsel. His grand pronouncements on global affairs vanished into the ether, or more likely, into the trash cans of various embassies. This was grim irony on a global scale. A man with no actual power was pretending to wield influence over continents, while the actual powerful ignored him completely. The sound of major world events, distant cannons firing in Mexico, the rustle of treaties being signed in Europe, it probably reached his ears only through the rustling pages of newspapers, filtered through his unique imperial perspective. He was the ultimate outsider looking in, not just at San Francisco, but at the entire world stage, convinced he had a leading role to play. His foreign policy decrees were masterpieces of ignored authority, proving that you can declare yourself ruler of anything, but you can't make the rest of the world care. Your ignored emails wish they had this level of commitment to futility. So Emperor Norton was busy being ignored by foreign powers. Fine, but his imperial gaze wasn't solely focused on distant lands. He also had ambitious plans for his immediate domain, San Francisco and the surrounding bay. He saw the growing traffic between San Francisco and Oakland across the bay. Ferries were okay, but for a proper empire, you needed something more permanent, something grand. So, like any good ruler, he issued decrees. Multiple times, actually starting as early as 1872, Emperor Norton decreed the construction of a bridge or tunnel across the San Francisco Bay. Imagine writing that decree while standing on the waterfront, smelling the salt and fish, watching boats chug by. He ordered surveys to be conducted, engineers to be consulted. He even specified details about the structure. This wasn't just a vague wish. This was imperial command laid out on paper demanding action. His ideas were dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic, impossible fantasies from a man living in poverty. Build a bridge across that, the vast, deep, unpredictable bay. Good joke, Emperor. Your wildest architectural dream wishes it had this much audacity and zero funding. Yet, decades after Emperor Norton's death, what happened? They built a bridge. The San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, completed in 1936, finally connected the two sides, just as the emperor had envisioned. It's a moment of stunning, almost cruel irony. The homeless eccentric, the butt of many jokes, had a clearer vision for the city's future infrastructure than most of the sane politicians and businessmen of his era. He saw the need for a connection that the practical minds deemed impossible or too expensive. His decrees about the bridge were perhaps his most prescient, a glimpse of genuine insight shining through the imperial delusion. It wasn't just madness. Sometimes it was genius dressed in a worn-out military coat, demanding surveys with pieces of paper worth maybe $1. The sound of ferries crisscrossing the bay would have been a constant reminder of the connection that wasn't there, the bridge that existed only in his decrees and his mind. He literally decreed reality into existence just 60 years too early. He was the ultimate urban planner, not with blueprints and zoning laws, but with conviction and a printing press. Emperor Norton, the man who couldn't manage a rice shipment, wanted to span one of the world's largest bays. And eventually, the world caught up to his crazy idea. Is even an emperor, even a self-appointed, wildly eccentric one, eventually runs out of time. You can abolish Congress, protect Mexico, and decree bridges, but you can't decree immortality. Emperor Norton's reign came to an abrupt end on the night of January 10, 1880. It was a particularly cold, wet night in San Francisco, fitting weather for a grim finale. The sound of rain on the cobblestones was probably the last thing he heard clearly. He collapsed on the corner of California and DuPont Street, right in the heart of the city he considered his kingdom. He was on his way to a lecture at the California Academy of Sciences. Even in his last moments, the emperor was heading to broaden his imperial mind. Your plans rarely end this dramatically or this damply. He was found by a police officer, not arrested this time but found unresponsive. He was quickly taken to the city receiving hospital. Despite his fame, his body was reportedly clothed in damp, cheap fabric, his pockets containing only a few dollars, a few of his uncashed imperial bonds, and a handful of letters, including one supposedly addressed to Queen Victoria. The smell of cheap, wet cloth clinging to him must have been heavy with the finality of his poverty. The cause of death was officially listed as apoplexy, basically a stroke. The reign didn't end with a coup or a declaration of abdication, but with a sudden, silent collapse on a street corner. It was an utterly ordinary end for an utterly extraordinary man. The ultimate punchline: the emperor died just like anyone else. News spread quickly. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a headline the next day, "Le Roi est mort." Other papers lamented the loss of their beloved emperor. The city that had humored him, supported him, and ultimately loved him was genuinely saddened. His death was a stark reminder that beneath the uniform and the titles was an old man who was, despite everything, poor and alone. The cold, hard pavement was his final throne. It was a moment of brutal truth cutting through the layers of shared fantasy. A grim reminder that even the most vibrant legends eventually meet a quiet, cold reality. So the emperor has passed away damply on a street corner. The city that had adopted him, humored him, and secretly cherished him was now faced with a problem. What do you do when your unofficial monarch dies with maybe $3 and some fantasy money in his pocket? You give him a send-off fit for an emperor. That's what you do. The news of Norton's death sparked an outpouring of grief and a fierce determination to give him a proper burial. This wasn't going to be a pauper's funeral. Citizens and businesses, the very people who had accepted his bonds and saluted his uniform, organized and funded a public funeral. They pooled resources, ensuring that the man who had presided over their city with nothing but conviction would be buried with dignity and maybe a little flair. The smell of money being spontaneously gathered for a dead, broke man must have been confusingly poignant. His funeral was held on January 12, 1880, just 2 days after his death. It wasn't just a few mourners, it was a phenomenon. An estimated 10,000 to 30,000 people lined the streets and attended the ceremony. Think about that, a third of the city's population turned out for a homeless eccentric. Your last birthday party wishes it had this kind of attendance. The procession was massive. Civic leaders, clergy, members of Masonic lodges, laborers, prostitutes, the wealthy, the poor, people of all races and classes walked together through the muddy streets. The sheer sound of thousands of footsteps echoing was the city's final collective salute. They carried his coffin, draped in an American flag, to Masonic cemetery. It was a state funeral, not by decree of the U.S. government, but by the will of the people of San Francisco. They had given him his crown in life. They gave him his final grand stage in death. This funeral wasn't just about burying a man. It was about marking the end of an era, the closing act of a unique citywide piece of performance art. They buried the uniform, the hat, the man, but the legend was just beginning. He couldn't afford a decent meal sometimes, but he got a funeral procession longer than most presidents will ever see. Grim irony, meet your peak performance. As the emperor is laid to rest, mourned by thousands, you might think that's where the story ends. Body in the ground, legend begins, fade to black, but Emperor Norton didn't just die, he became immortal. His reign, though purely symbolic, left an indelible mark on San Francisco and seeped into American culture. He wasn't forgotten, he became a character, a myth, a punchline, and sometimes a strangely inspiring figure. Writers were fascinated by him. Mark Twain, who lived in San Francisco during part of Norton's reign, reportedly based the character of the king in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn partly on the emperor. Robert Louis Stevenson, another literary giant in the city, also wrote about the emperor, capturing his strange dignity. His story became literature, preserved in ink and paper like his decrees. San Francisco never let him go. Plaques commemorating Emperor Norton dot the city. Businesses are named after him. Historical societies celebrate him. His imperial bonds, once used to buy bread, are now collector's items, selling for far more than their face value. The paper that smelled like desperation now smells like history and resale value. His story is a constant reminder of the city's unique ability to create its own reality, to elevate eccentricity to royalty. It highlights how a community can provide dignity and even a form of belonging to someone the rest of the world would simply discard as mad or homeless. He became a symbol of resistance, of nonconformity, of the sheer power of believing in yourself, even when no one else does. Except when an entire city decides to join your delusion. Your personal brand wishes it was this resilient and widely adopted. Norton's legacy isn't just historical trivia, it's a mirror. It shows our need for spectacle, our willingness to participate in shared fantasies, and perhaps our discomfort with people who live outside the lines of conventional sanity and success. We laughed at him, we humored him, we used him for entertainment, and then we gave him a state funeral and made him a legend. He predicted the Bay Bridge, stood up for minorities, and reminded a rapidly industrializing world that there was room for magic, even if that magic was just one man's unwavering belief in his own imaginary power. The clatter of the modern city still echoes with the ghost of his footsteps and the rustle of his long-dead decrees. So there you have it. Emperor Norton I, the homeless monarch, the protector of Mexico, the man who abolished Congress and was mourned by tens of thousands. He was crazy, yes. He was broke, absolutely. He was also a product of a city's chaos and generosity, a living legend created by collective will. You thought history was written by kings and presidents in palaces. Sometimes it's written by a broke man in a borrowed uniform, handing out handwritten laws on a street corner. His story is a dark comedy about power, poverty, and the porous border between delusion and reality. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What shared fantasies are you participating in right now? What normal things are just collective agreements that could shatter tomorrow? He built an empire not with armies or wealth, but with conviction and the complicity of a city that needed a show. And in the end, isn't that kind of performance, that kind of shared belief, what a lot of power is built on anyway, just with better suits and less interesting hats? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Would your city crown an emperor? Are you secretly ruling a small nation from your living room? Don't lie. This wasn't just history. It was a warning, a punchline, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one who just decided he was.